Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 28th of April 2023. Let's get to, let's not get to the front line first. Let's have a little look at what the ISW Institute for the Study of War American think tank says in their preamble. They are talking about how the Russian military are reshuffling their leadership. Three command organs are reportedly receiving new leadership as part of that reshuffle because they are associated with managing aspects of Russian force generation, troop sustainment, and logistical oversight. There was the butcher of Mariupol was moved aside in one of these logistics moves. There have been other people, and there's also someone sacked for stealing T-90 engines. As I said yesterday, this kind of movement is often a reflection of things not going well. You don't move people around. You don't fix what ain't broke, right? So if your army is operating chef's kiss, then you don't change it around. So I think this is indicative of a bit of a problem within the Russian military hierarchy, and in fact the execution of their offensive that really amounted to very little. Russian forces are reportedly using new tactics to complicate Ukrainian air defense's ability to detect Russian missiles. Russian forces conducted 4-caliber missile strikes on Mykolaiv city on the 27th. The Ukrainian sources report that the Russian forces directed the missiles using different terrain features, different heights of launches, and multiple trajectory changes to complicate their detection by Ukrainian air defenses. You'd imagine that would be the case for sure. Anyway, I mean, that's sensible operation of missiles. Before we get onto the front line, I just want to go to Rebar, the pro-Russian source. Before it goes onto the front line in its talk, and I've cut off stuff. It talks about, Ukrainians were shelling this area, doing this, and this was happening there, and whatever, which is usually not too eventful. There was one interesting bullet point, which is this: the AFU used 7 combat drones to attack the city of Ravenki in Luhansk People's Republic. Now, Ravenki is a city, and I talked to you about this the other day. It was a target for a drone attack, or I assume it was a drone attack, on an oil depot, and I think Ravenki is there, and it caused some significant damage 2 or 3 nights ago. Well, if it's been attacked again, and it's been hit by 7 drones, and it says the 5 of them were intercepted, and the remaining 2 detonated, damaging the administrative and technical premises of the oil depot. I don't know if this is the same event that happened previously, and Rebar just reporting on it now, or whether this is a subsequent attack. But it's interesting that, when you hear these or see images of these places exploding or fires in a place where the Ukrainians have targeted, what you don't realize is, because you think, they've hit it, that's a drone or a missile, but actually it's 7 drones, as according to Rebar, 5 not succeeding in getting through. We can't verify the accuracy of that claim, but it is interesting that that's a concerted effort on that one place with a number of drones, possibly having different trajectories, different heights, and all these things that we see in the Russian caliber cruise missile attacks. Also, I think it talks to the idea that the Russians have pulled back behind 100 kilometers to prevent the HIMARS with their 84-kilometer optimal range of hitting depots and this and that. And okay, this might have been an oil depot. It's not so much like pulling stuff back, but I get the impression now that the Ukrainians are using quite a lot of drone, maybe a number of different types of drone to hit targets where HIMARS just can't reach, the parts of Ukraine that HIMARS just can't reach. So anyway, that's just my supposition. Let's go to the northeast sector of the front line, Kupiansk-Kreminna, which on my map looks like this. Kupiansk here, Svatva just down there. And nothing in Rebar. In fact, that's all kind of Bakhmut stuff now. But the ISW does say Russian forces conducted defensive operations in the Kupiansk direction yesterday. The Russian MOD claimed that elements of Russian Western Group forces destroyed 4 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups near Novosibirsk, Vilshana, and Krokmalna. So that is to say that the Russians are claiming the Ukrainians had reconnaissance and sabotage groups in Volshana, Krokmalna, which is just south of there. There it is, somewhere around there, and as well in, was that Novosibirsk 2? That's my memory going there already. I've only just read it. Yeah, Novosibirsk, which is Kuzmivka and Novosibirsk there. So some activity from Ukrainian reconnaissance groups, but otherwise it's pretty positional, artillery duels and whatnot. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces in the Kupiansk direction did not conduct any offensive operations, are continuing to fortify their positions and use drones to adjust artillery fire. A Russian mill blogger remarked that the situation in Kupiansk direction has not changed significantly and that mutual artillery strikes and reconnaissance operations are occurring along that line of contact. And then there's activity down in Makiivka, Zravka Gully, and in the Serebryanska forest. Ukrainians claiming there are unsuccessful attacks there. So Makiivka, Serebryanska forest, sorry, and in that general area, the Zravka Gully, which is up in this area, still haven't come to a firm conclusion on what's going on in this area. There was some back and forth between the Ukrainians and the Russians in terms of territory gained and lost. And then really we come on to Bakhmut. It's all about Bakhmut, I guess, along the front line as the Russian offensive phase has drawn to an end. They're still waiting to take Bakhmut, which they probably will do. It doesn't look like the Ukrainians are going to mount a counterattack. At least, they could be waiting for Russia to take Bakhmut and then encircle them. There could be that option. But it seems that, as I've said before, Bakhmut has served its purpose. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We'll just go to ISW before we go on to other sources. Milgot blogger claimed on April 27th that Wagner forces reached, so there are contradictory claims going on here, reached the main entrance to Bakhmut from Kromova, immediately west of Bakhmut, and Ivaniska, and cut the main but not final Ukrainian logistics line into Bakhmut, but that's not been confirmed, which is, I've not seen that anywhere other than that claim, which is to say that they have sort of advanced to Bakhmut through Kromova, and that is there, and even from Ivaniska area, but that would be pretty significant if that had happened. One Russian mill blogger claimed that Wagner Group forces broke through Ukrainian lines near Kromova, but another claimed that Wagner forces have not yet entered the settlement. So you've got three completely different claims there. One, they've gone through Kromova to Bakhmut. One, they've broken lines near Kromova, and one, they've not yet entered it. So, those are all Russian sources. So when people talk about ISW, they're biased. It's like they're just presenting Russian sources here in these kind of ones. It's like you can make up your own mind of what you think's happened, and it will say whether it thinks that that's been confirmed or not, from usually from geolocated video footage and pictures. But in this case, these are just very different Russian claims concerning the same area. Then it talks about how there's a Eastern Military District forces that have been operating in Vuhledar and in Zaporizhia Oblast are now appearing in Bakhmut. So we are potentially seeing this idea that we really do seem to be seeing this idea that Wagner forces are culminated. They can't recruit. They're not being able to force regenerate and reconstitute. They just don't have the numbers. So they have pulled back from the north and the south, all the while being supported also in the center by elements of the VDV, conventional forces, DPR, in this case, the Eastern Military District forces. So it looks like this is now becoming very much a cooperative effort as everyone is piling into Bakhmut because they want this final western area so that they can claim victory by May the 9th. That would really that really suit their narrative. And that would certainly be something that that Putin would like. He wanted that on a previous historic date. It didn't happen. I would wonder if Ukraine might have something up their sleeve before May the 9th. It'd be nice to put a stymie on that particular day. But there's been no reported exchanges of territory to the north and to the south of Bakhmut. Let's look at what Poulet-Volon says. Poulet-Volon's map, sorry, I forgot to say, coming down towards Bakhmut, we have some pushback around Bilohorivka still and Verkhnokamianska, whilst the Russians are pushing on in the forest. That was one I forgot to mention. Anyway, let's go now to the the maps. So War Mapper says, as you can see, it's this area there that's been seen most of the advances. Russia have continued west and advanced up to the main road out of Bakhmut, which passes along the edge of the city. I've not seen this in other mappers. I've seen this move, so it's interesting that War Mappers reporting that. Vuhledar has, as you can see, not further down south like War Mapper just had, but yeah, very much up here, reaching that main road and advancing westwards fairly consistently. Syriac Maps has up to that main road. These blocks here are being taken, so Russian positions, and that's geolocated. Around the industrial college, just to let you know, if we zoom in, that is this area there. So that's the industrial college. Both the mappers, my yellow line for the pro-Ukrainian mapper deep state map has that movement up to this road, and the pro-Russian map in red, Syriac Maps, has that as well. So there's some agreement. It's a little bit disagreement of a pocket of blocks there. There were no other movements to the north by either mappers, actually. So this has stayed stable all along here. And then War Mapper seems to think there's an increase in Russian territory around there. Right, let's move on and look at some images of Bakhmut just to give you an idea of the kind of destruction. When you see rubble like that, that is FAB 500 bombs as far as I'm concerned, or buildings that have been mined by the Ukrainians themselves and blown up, and we'll see some images, some video footage of that in a second. Otherwise, artillery looks more like this. Blackened buildings, artillery shells that might, cause a few bits of wall to break and crumble, but they're not going to make a whole building like this fall down. It's the same with Vuhledar, and I've been talking about that recently, how the Russians are using FAB 500s to do much more fundamental damage to the buildings that artillery is unable to do. Now, here's the building that was mined, and that's probably the previous rubble that you saw from a different direction. This building was blown up by the Ukrainians themselves, and that's been geolocated by someone there, or at least located. To here. Well, this is the explosion taking place, and that you can see is a pretty huge set of explosives detonating below that building. I said in the news video this morning that it could be because there were Russians inside, that and or to take that building out so it can't be used as a position to have snipers or spotters over the lower ground of the Ukrainians nearby. But then if you're going to do it to that building, really, you need to do it to all those buildings, and that's the case. But so on and so forth. You can work out the reasoning why that might happen, but it's still quite impressive in its destructive, in its destruction. That it's Trent, right, let's talk about basic theories around Bakhmut. So your pro-Russians will look at this, and people in my thread will say, "Oh, look at that! The Russians there's hardly anything left under control of the Ukrainians. This will be a great victory for the Russians." But that has pretty much it's not been about territory, at least as far as I've understood it, and as far as I've been saying over the last however long. Like, Bakhmut has no intrinsic value, and losing Bakhmut to the Russians has no intrinsic value that is gained by the Russians. They don't gain any logistic advantage. They don't gain any X, Y, and Z. All that you can say is that you have to take Bakhmut if you have any hope of taking the Donbass, but then Chasiv Yar will be the next back. It's taken 9 months to not quite take Bakhmut, right? It's incredible. It's embarrassing. The Russians should be embarrassed, and any pro-Russian voice in the thread that goes, "Oh, cope," you actually should be embarrassed. That's really unimpressive. Deeply, deeply unimpressive for the second greatest army in the world to march into Ukraine, get beaten back from Kiev, run away from Kharkiv, and withdraw from Kherson and not be able to take Bakhmut. It's just, well done, guys. Excellent. And then Bakhmut does, the only value that Bakhmut has is in its extrinsic value for being able to, you can't take these places without taking Bakhmut. You can't have this pocket left there not taken if you want to take the whole of the Donbass, whole of Donetsk here and Luhansk. So anyway, that aside, um, it's not about territory for the Ukrainians. Ukrainians, as I've been saying for some days, they've been basically operationally withdrawing whilst trying to bleed the Russians as much as possible. And they are making the claim still that that is still in their favor. Their remaining in Bakhmut is still advantageous for attriting the Russian forces. And we can see this because, one, the Wagner forces are culminating. They're not able to recruit and they can't regenerate their forces. Two, which is borne out by two other PMCs being thrown into the area, such as Shoigu's PMC Redut and the Gazprom PMCs being thrown in. And also conventional forces. Today, we've heard that the Eastern Military District forces are in Bakhmut area, and we are also seeing VDV, the paratroopers there, and the DPR there. So everyone is helping out Wagner because they have now culminated. They don't have the troops to do it themselves because they have been attrited. And all these other forces are being attrited as well. In other words, it's exactly what the Ukrainians want, which is grind down the Russians, and then that leaves them thinned out. So if they're bringing people from Zaporizhia, those people aren't in Zaporizhia Oblast, right? If they're bringing people from other PMCs, then those other PMCs aren't operating elsewhere, right? The Redut were down in Vuhledar. They're not now. They're in Bakhmut, which means Vuhledar is somewhat weaker than it was in terms of the Russian force there. So it is demonstrably doing what the Ukrainians are claiming it's doing, and the kind of dismissal, hand waving of pro-Russian voices in the thread below, etc., are not good enough. It's not good enough to say, yeah, whatever, don't believe it. It's literally, it's what explains the data. There's nothing else that explains the data. There's nothing else that explains the fact that it's still 9 months and the Russians haven't taken it, and they're throwing lots of other varied resources at the problem. They would only have to do that if they were running out of the troops they had there previously, which means it is working as far as Ukraine has, in a way that Ukraine has claimed. Right. So then you get people like Trentelenko saying this was anyone with two brain cells to rub together could see this reality, both because the Russians were not that good, but especially due to it being dead center of Ukraine's death of 1,000 cuts attritional grand strategy. Ukraine would take any engagement with the Russians that gave it a high exchange ratio that would swiftly abandon any which were not. It's how Ukraine rolls. And Ukraine's death of 1,000 cuts attritional grand strategy has been systematically targeting Russia's high-tech and impossible to replace equipment and personnel on a priority basis to hollow out the Russian military firepower. This is one of the reasons why Russian artillery is now far less accurate and responsive in April 2023 than it was in April 2022. And this is an important point. Ukraine has been killing Russian forward observers for the last year faster than the Russians can train replacements with secure digital radios. And he draws on what Philip O'Brien was saying, who said the Ukrainians seem to be slowly pulling out the edge of Bakhmut. See the most up-to-date deep state map. It's a vindication of their decision to force the Russians to fight for the city for the last few months and an example of the fundamental weaknesses in Russian war-making. Now, this is super important. Let's expand this map. Here is a map from 8 weeks ago. The Ukrainian lines bulged into the Russian front. The last thing that a competent military would execute, or that could competent military that could execute combined arms would have done, would be to bash through the city. They would have focused on cutting off the Ukrainians in the bulge. In other words, what the Russians should have done is cut down from Kromove, cut up from the south, cut this whole bulge off, and win Bakhmut and take out a load of Ukrainian defenders in doing so. But they failed to do this. And Ukraine, it was looking hairy for a bit, and then Ukraine fully defended this whole southern area and the north, so that the north hasn't really moved over the last few weeks. And in fact, Kromova has been really fiercely fought over, but the Ukrainians have done enough to defend that neck from being constricted. which means that the Russians had to go through Bakhmut, which is what you don't want to do if you're an attacking army. You don't want to have to commit what has to be someone like 5 to 7 to 9 to 1 force ratio in order to take really tough urban environments like that. And in doing so, you will attrit at a greater rate than the defenders. It's just that's the kind of known theory. Now, it might not always be the case, but it's theoretically the case here. It's been the case in previous conflicts, and Ukraine is claiming that is still the case here. So and we're looking at the way that Russia are throwing all of these random forces into Bakhmut. So all of the data suggests that this has been highly attritional for Russia, that this has not worked in their favor. They were unable to constrict the neck around Kromova and in the south near Ivanivska and the south of Bakhmut near the monument, the airplane monument. And as a result, they've had to go through and they've lost more troops. It is a failure, and it will be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians at most. The Russians could not do that, Phillips O'Brien continues, even though they had the Ukrainians in a vulnerable position. Instead, they've gone slowly and self-destructively right through the city, and the Ukrainians are still there, able to pull back in good order, never cut off. It was certainly why all senior Ukrainian officials I talked with, so he gets to talk to people I don't, right? And he's a military historian and author, and etc., and lecturer. I talked with civilian and military were adamant that fighting for Bakhmut was in Ukraine's interest and to Ukraine's advantage. And they were right. I went through phases of going, I'm not sure. At the most, I was like, I'm not sure. I don't know whether it's the right decision. But I've now come to the conclusion that the Ukrainians must at least have calculated and thought is the right decision. Otherwise, as I said previously, no one wakes up in the morning and say, I'm going to make a really crap decision today. Whoop! Yeah, let's keep defending Bakhmut because I know it's a rubbish decision. No one does that. You say, right, I've done all the evaluations, and on balance, I'm going to take political considerations, military tactical considerations, operational considerations, strategic considerations, and we will maintain our defense of Bakhmut. So it has been in their best interest as far as they know and are claiming, and etc. So finally, Thomas Tyner throws his tuppence in. He says, Bakhmut, the Germans threw 170,000 at Stalingrad. After 2 months, they had lost 130,000 and driven the Soviets into a 350 by 200 meter cauldron and a 50 meter strip along the Volga. On the 15th of November 1942, the Germans were exhausted. On the 19th of November, the Soviets were ready and started Operation Uranus, which we all know is Operation Uranus. Come on, school kids. So there is precedence for this, okay, in Soviet Union's own history. I say own history because let's face it, the Russian Federation is Soviet Union 2.0. Even if the coming days Ukrainian troops exit Bakhmut, we don't know if this is a defeat or victory. But as we don't know what the Ukrainian military's goal was, hold Bakhmut, grind the Russians down, win time, all three, I think it's all three, or for an outsider, the Soviet situation in Stalingrad looked like a defeat. But it wasn't, as a stubborn Soviet resistance drew ever more German forces in, which thinned out the German flanks, where the Soviets then broke through. Is it a moral blow to lose Bakhmut? I would say it is, but it doesn't change the frontline situation in that sector. There are many more Ukrainian lines behind Bakhmut. Taking on Bakhmut only leads to taking Bakhmut, unlike, for example, if the Germans had taken Bastogne in 1944. So, have the Ukrainians drawn in and exhausted the Russian reserves? I don't know, but we'll soon find out. Ukraine will go on the offensive, and how much resistance the Russians will mount will tell us if Bakhmut was worth all the sacrifices. And don't judge the Ukrainian offensive too early. A half-hearted attack might be a feint to draw Russian reserves to the front's extreme flanks. A slow attack might be a trap to draw Russian troops forward into a pincer. Is the Ukrainian goal to encircle Russian troops, or to annihilate Russian troops, or to liberate Mariupol and Melitopol, or all three in sequence? We don't know yet, but we will. Great set of threads there, and I just have to agree. So yes, although, as Rebar says here, the Russian assault units continue to advance in central Bakhmut, and fighters broke through the enemy's defense line near the garage complex and forced it to retreat. And in the southern outskirts of the city, Wagner PMC assault groups have liberated the Vodokanal district and are fighting near the key Yuvelina Chayevskovgohos junction. And all the enemy's attempts to seize the initiative are suppressed by the targeted fire of the Russian artillery. All that being said, this is still a victory, or victory is a loaded word, isn't it? This is still it to the advantage of the Ukrainian army. That's and I'm ever more certain of that. You know, in my opinion, no matter what happens to Bakhmut now, Ukrainians have already won there, won in inverted commas, because it doesn't look like a win, does it, to cede territory? But it's a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, and we talked about Pyrrhic victories before, and I showed you the history of that in a previous video. A Pyrrhic victory is, yeah, you win, but you exhaust yourself, so you eventually lose, and that appears to be what's going on. Okay, so as we pull out, I thought it's really important to talk about that today. There will be pro-Russian voices on the thread, you know, doing their lol kind of laughing face emoji, crying with tears of laughter because that's so hilarious to try and bring up that theory. Is like, yeah, what explains it? It's taken you guys 9 months to not take Bakhmut, and now you're throwing the kitchen sink at it. Yeah, it's because you haven't done very well, isn't it? Anyway, let's go on further south to Avdivka, and some activity around there. So not much to report in terms of territorial exchanges. There's been fighting all around. If you go to ISW, it talks about all the usual places: Krasnohorivka, Nevelska, Severny, Vodyani, Pervomaisky, etc., etc. All of those places repelled attacks. What might be of interest to viewers is to check out reporting from Ukraine's video talking about how a whole mechanized unit of the Russians was taken out in Nevelska, just, you know, taken out by ATGMs and artillery, and they lost, you know, troops and equipment around there, and that could have fed into yesterday's really high figures of APCs lost. There were no. I forgot to say there were no tanks lost yesterday, and it's partly because I just think they're running out of tanks. The partly why you see fewer tanks getting destroyed on a daily basis now is that, well, they've got 2,000 plus tanks fewer tanks than they did a year ago, and that's a lot of tanks, right? And if you suddenly don't have them, you don't have the tanks to throw into battle. We know that they're struggling to build them. We know they're struggling to get new tanks to the front line. They're bringing old T-55s to the front line. So this suggests that they don't have the tanks. And if you don't have the tanks, it's hard to blow them up. And this is why we're seeing APC IFVs being sent in where you'd normally expect IFVs, tanks, troops to work in combined arms. You're just seeing IFVs just sent and then blown up, sometimes individually. And you're thinking, well, that's because they just don't have the capacity of that mechanized equipment left. Anyway, that's Avdivka, so not a lot to report. A little bit on Marinka. There's some footage of Marinka. So I'm seeing quite a lot of this, and sometimes I don't know whether it's repeated footage, but there are a lot of these tanks and vehicles getting taken out by FPV, first-person view drones that where the camera points in the direction you're actually flying and not down, and it allows these to be used. These are racing drones that allow these to be used as kamikaze drones, and there are just many pieces of kit being taken out by these tanks as well. Yeah, these are all tanks, I think. So all in the same kind of area, and I'm just unsure of how much is repeated footage, but the locations for these, let's go and check these out. I do like to do a little bit of geolocation. This is in this area, so that's a first-person view drone. As you can see, that's quite a long way back from the back line. And if you're a Russian tank, you're thinking, right, let's move up to the front line. I'm safe here. I'm driving around. I'm doing my stuff. Happy days. And then suddenly you're blown up. You're not safe. And drones, just, goodness me, I wouldn't like to be in the army. It's just horrific and horrible. Just thinking the chances of me dying today are a lot higher than if I was working in a coffee shop. But yeah, nowadays with drones, you're not safe anywhere. Drones and long range munition and eyes in the sky and all of this stuff, artillery, precision artillery, is just like I just imagine being in any kind of capacity in this war anywhere within, you know, what, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers of the front line. You're like, yeah, I could die today. There's a much greater chance of me dying today than if I was just blogging from home, for example. So anyway, that's Marinka. It says in the ISW that it just sort of mentions Marinka here. Denis Pushilin claimed that Russian forces control 50 out of 59 blocks in Marinka, and one Mill blogger complained that Russian forces are unable to encircle Ukrainian forces in Marinka due to inadequate counter-battery fire. So slightly different claims. Some saying that they can't do enough. So, Denis Pushilin, head of the DPR, isn't he? I think saying that hey, we control a vast percentage, 50 out of 59 blocks, which is to say that 9 blocks remain in the Ukrainian control. Well, I presume this is a block here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, actually, there's loads more than that. So I don't know what he means by that, and whether he's just talking. He's adhering to Operation Uranus by, talking out of it. Right, then we're going to go on to. It's really childish, isn't it? Get over it. We're going to move on further down south. Russian forces did not conduct any confirmed ground attacks in western Donetsk. A Russian Mill blogger claimed on April 26th that Russian forces conducted positional battles in a forest belt on the outskirts of Vuhledar and the Mikhailska Dacha area. So there we're starting to see positional battles rather than outright offences. That could be because they just don't have enough mechanized equipment to throw at places like Vuhledar. They would need reinforcements, reconstitution, and regeneration of that mechanized equipment. Are they going to get it? Probably not. So they just lob lead from a further distance away. I just want, before I go on to Kherson and talk a little bit about that, I forgot to say this about Rebar, saying about Avdivka, south of Pervomaysky, Russian troops supported by heavy armoured vehicles attack AFU strongholds near Nivelska. Having entrenched southeast of the populated area, the assault groups are dissecting the enemy's defences in the area. That's referring, one must assume, to the footage that reporting from Ukraine talks about and shows how the Russians were destroyed, like annihilated in that area. And so it's really interesting where you got reporting from Ukraine who's giving actually geolocated footage of that, and showing at least 3 Russian vehicles blown up. And then you got Rebar saying, we're dissecting the enemy's defenses in the area. It's like, those 2 things can't be true, and one of them has video evidence, and the other is a bullet point in a Telegram post. I wonder who I believe. Anyway, we're going to go to Kherson, and I know this has been a long one today. There's a lot going on in Kherson in terms of all sorts. First of all, let's go to. I talked to you about these APKWS rockets that are hot off the press, I guess, hot off the manufacturing line that the Ukrainians are now using, and the 37th Marine Brigade is using them to take out some different targets, Oshkosh, and all sorts of. That's a kind of truck, but yeah, targets at the other side of the Dnipro River. Let's see where they are attacking. So these rockets are being used here. So this is northeast of the Kherson, firing across the river in the Krynki area. That's one of them. And then another one is going to be just right next to it, right? Just might as well do that as well. And yep, that is a pretty similar position. Then geo confirmation of the same sort of stuff. Let's just see if this throws up anything wildly different. Yeah, so a little bit further down. So they are hitting places all around here. Now, that is interesting because that is an uptick in that kind of activity. So why are they doing that now? Is this part of the coming counteroffensive? Right? Is this the Ukrainians softening up targets here, shaping the battlefield, ready for actually doing some supporting maneuver across the Dnipro? I've talked about this, saying, well, it could now be. It wasn't something I would have thought, given how difficult it is going to be to get across that river. However, it might well be. Then this geo confirmed also, as well as doing geolocation of those hits, said, interesting, that 37th Marine Brigade who's doing that activity is claimed to be one of the 9 Ukrainian counteroffensive brigades. So one of the counteroffensive brigades is in place with new weapons hitting targets across the river with precision munition. That's interesting. Make of that what you will. Right, map of Ukrainian forces crossing the Dnipro River in Kherson. ISW previously reported that Ukrainian forces established positions north of Oleshki in some of the islands. As of today, at least 6 large islands are partially contested as both sides conduct airstrikes on them. So this is how Ukraine battle map out these islands, with some sort of grey areas, Ukrainian control and Russian control. So that is a bit more granular than I've seen from other mappers. Interesting analysis there. I had a rant this morning on my news video because the Russians in this area are using FAB 500 munitions, these guided bombs from planes that are being able to get. So if they say they have a 50-kilometer range, then actually they can drop these bombs from sort of that distance, right? And they can hit and are hitting places along the Dnipro River, the west bank of the Dnipro River. So then I said, well, it looks like the S-300s have been brought in, which have like a 70-kilometer range, so that they can maybe be placed here to then try and take out airplanes that are coming to drop these bombs. But then these are being taken out by Lancets, loitering kamikaze drones, and they are losing these high-value S-300 targets. And it really annoys me that they're not protecting them adequately. They're parking them in the middle of fields and then getting pretty depressed when loitering munitions blow them up. It's like, well, yeah, if you park it in the middle of a field, that's what's going to happen. So an interesting to and fro between air frames, causing damage, air defense being brought in, drones taking out the air defenses. And I think that is to the advantage of the Russians here, and that needs to be solved. Lancet drones are a huge problem, and it's a problem they still haven't solved. They produce their own versions. They're these FPV, first-person view drones, that I think are actually have larger munitions on them by the looks of it. Although it's quite variable with the Lancets. But there's one thing to say, well, we've got our own version of that, but there's another thing to say, well, yeah, but it's still not taking out the Lancets. What are you doing about stopping Lancets blowing up S-300s, for example? It's a problem. Anyway, sorry to bang on. It's been a long one today. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all the support you have given. That's the Frontline update for today, the 28th. I didn't mention that the Russians are defending the power plant there, the nuclear power plant. There's been a lot of talk about them really reinforcing that with troops and mechanized equipment and whatnot. So that's something to watch out for, because it is, at the end of the day, a nuclear power plant. Anyway, cheers, take care, speak to you later.